Hey there, welcome to Kaleidoscope Live. We are the Kaleidoscope authors from the British Journal of Psychiatry. And as we do each month, we're going to talk through some papers that we have in the Kaleidoscope column. So we're going to kick off with COVID and ketamine this month. And I'm going to start with a paper from Lancet Psychiatry by Pan et al. On COVID and mental health. So this is clearly very topical for lots of people. And there's no doubt about COVID impacting people's well-being. So unprecedented, moral injury, and tsunami are the words we get with COVID all the time. And the concern is how much is it impacting people's mental health? So it impacts all our lives. We know this. It's fairly obvious. Where I am in Southeast London, we've definitely seen an increase in demand on services. And what's interesting for us, and we're trying to understand it, is there's been an increase in people who haven't been known to us, or haven't used services before. And so if we think about what COVID might do, it's a pressure on people. People might be worried about their health and their well-being, people around them, their physical health, their mental health. People might have practical issues in their lives. They might be furloughed. They might lose their jobs. And then the resources that we tap into are not there anymore, not in the same way. So the things you like to do if you're feeling stressed, maybe you like to go to the cinema, you like to go to restaurants. With us, we like opera and monster truck rallies, the COVID team, the things you would do ordinarily to look after yourself. So increased pressure, decreased resources, and then services are stretched. So there's an increased push on the NHS. And what does it mean? And going back to the tsunami thing, the reason I picked this paper is there's been a lot of data. One of the most amazing statistics I saw was that by December 2020, there had been an estimated 200,000 scientific publications with COVID in it. 200,000, which is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm going to come back to at the end of it, that makes you challenge the quality of all the 200,000. But you have a tension with COVID. People want information really quickly because we've got this new pandemic, so you want to share fast. But then the tension for that maybe is the caliber of it. And my concern with the mental health part has been a lot of stuff has been surveys. People are understandably asking, how do you feel about it? And there are lots of problems with survey data. So maybe you only respond if you feel anxious or you feel upset, and what you compare to. So what's quite nice for me about this PAN paper, and the reason I picked it, is they took a pre-existing longitudinal cohort study. So what that means is it's a group of people that have already been following up. So they've got lots of data on them for some period of time. It's a Dutch study. They've got people with depression and anxiety and OCD, and they've been tracking them over time, and they've been comparing them to healthy volunteers. So they can track any change, and what they added into their data set were some new questionnaires about how people are feeling. I'm going to pick out some headline findings and what it means to me, and then I'll pass over to the others to discuss. The two really major things that struck me. So one is there was an increase in concern from people who didn't have pre-existing mental health problems about their well-being, but those who already had mental health problems did not report significant increases. So that's really interesting. So those already under services. So in one sense, it almost tracks back to what we've seen locally in Southeast London, that it's new presentations to services. And it just makes me think that pandemic is clearly a problem for lots of people. No one's denying it. But these data are suggesting it's not hitting everyone equally. It's not causing a tsunami. Lots of people are clearly quite resilient. And another really interesting phrase for me through the pandemic has been post-traumatic growth, that people can do well with it. It's introduced the idea of inequity. So if we think about how people are doing now in the longer term, there's been issues around inequity in terms of some people are physically more vulnerable to get COVID. But if you think longer term, even post-pandemic, when we're all vaccinated, hopefully, some people will lose their jobs, some people are going to be unemployed, some people are going to be lonely. And it introduces again for me the issue about the quality of some of the academic research that's coming out about COVID. And do we risk causing concern and panic unnecessarily for people with words such as tsunami? So that's my opening blitz on that. Who's got a comment on it?
Right, I'm happy to comment. First of all, I think you don't need to worry about your tsunami of COVID-related publications, because as we know, nobody ever reads those. Out of those 2,000 publications, the chances of anybody actually reading them is going to be pretty slim, unless they make it into the kind of main newspaper kind of headlines. And there you need to have something a bit more striking. And bad news is always much more popular than good news. So actually something like the results of this paper are essentially largely uninteresting to the media, and I haven't seen it widely kind of displayed anywhere. For me, there was a couple of related things. One unrelated to the paper was that we had a lab meeting yesterday where one of our researchers presented their data looking at carers of people who suffered from autism and eating disorders. And one of the things that, because the sampling frame just covered the period of COVID, was about what had happened for them. And one of the things which was counterintuitive was that people, the carers of these folks, said actually they, on the positive side, lots of people, general people, now understood how constrained their lives had been previously. So that people who are caring for people who are quite ill and need constant attention are used to being at home and not being able to go out without any kind of arrangement. So they felt that one thing was that people would now understand what it's like to be the carer of somebody. And kind of just following on from that, the things that are discussed by the authors as to the reason why perhaps people with coexisting mental health disorders are not so impacted by the actual, by the COVID and the lockdown, is the fact that somehow society has now synchronized to them, that they never went out very much. They didn't have routines to the same degree and the desire to go out of an evening or socialize because of their illness, that their behavior was already constrained, and somehow society now fitted them much better. And so actually you were relative to everyone else, which is our kind of way of deciding where we are. So the reason why you feel upset at any particular point is because Dan's doing so much better than you, and he's so much more attractive than you, and he's, you know, losing weight faster than you. Pick any index of self-esteem, he's cleverer than you, you know, all of these things. That it's a lot of that self-esteem is relative. So now society is now synchronized to them. So in a way, there's less difference between them and society. So therefore the kind of the very sharp contrast is no longer there, and therefore you're a little bit less stressed about the fact you're not performing as well as other people.
It is hard to be in the shadow of Dan. It's so true. I do think, though, actually, you said a word. I'm going to come from a really different angle, which I think might be my role. But you said counterintuitive. And it's really funny because why? Why hasn't this paper, which actually has cracking methods, it seems really robust in a bunch of ways that no one could have ever planned for, but I hope someone benefits from. I think it's that it's counterintuitive. Like, I imagine in the US, we always do this with presidents when they're on their way out the door. We have a picture of them before when they were starting term and they were like full of hope and beaming. And then at the end, and they've aged like 25 years. And I feel like if you did the same to me, and I'm doing okay, but there would be like pre-COVID Dawn, and then there will be the desiccated husk that I will become by the end of this. And you will know it. And I feel it. And I think that part of the reason why we don't necessarily pick up on these messages is because no matter what, no matter how well things are going for us, there is still a baseline strain that makes it hard to pull this really positive data out, because you think, oh, but, you know, oh, but I'm so stressed, or oh, but XYZ, this person, that person, whatever. You do a bunch of relative things. So I started looking into the data when we were going to talk about this around resilience. Now, with that said, it is part of the 200,000 plus publications. But when I was just kind of digging around for like what had come out in the last couple of months, one was looking for psychosocial factors that were associated with people who were displaying resilience during this period of time. And to be fair, again, I think it's a kind of a quick and dirty survey, but it was done during peak lockdown time, which is kind of helpful. And they really came away with the idea that if you have a positive attribution style, and the thing is, this is something that can be cultivated in people. So it's not necessarily relevant maybe today, but it could be relevant for skills to work on in the future. And then the other paper I stumbled upon, which was just a great delight to me, was the idea that horror fans and the morbidly curious were doing better in all of this. And it kind of comes back to this idea that we expose ourselves to these kinds of things. And it's quite weird, right? It is, again, counterintuitive. But we watch this stuff. Contagion. Apparently, the first few weeks of the of the pandemic, the Netflix demand for Contagion was through the roof. And so what they found is folks who sort of dip their toes in that space already were really giving weight to these theories that, in fact, this type of stuff is almost the equivalent of adult play, where we're trying on different worlds and we're trying on different potential reactions to see how we would do in such circumstances. Those folks seem to have a leg up on resilience. So that is my from left field contribution.
I was going to mention books by Albert Camus. We mix in different cultural circles. But it is interesting with that, which you see in war times too, that I'm curious to see culturally, I'm slightly digressing, but remind me, in the coming year or two, that people then want hope and happiness. So I'm curious actually if we're going to see lots of dramas and movies around good times and happiness, and we'll move away from the morbidity.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that. I was really interested in what you said, Dawn, because the first thing I did in the first lockdown was dig out a copy of Contagion and watch it, because I thought, I've never watched this movie. Colleagues of mine in infectious diseases said it's probably the only really good, close to bordering on the truth representation of what a pandemic would look like. So I watched it for that reason. It's very good, by the way, but it also really entertains me because I'm one of the people that in my circle that would comfortably say that I've not been greatly affected by lockdown. It's not something that, and I'm saying that with some humility insofar as I'm lucky that I haven't been affected by it. But my collection of George Romero zombie flicks has grown substantially in the time. So maybe I'm one of those people you're talking about in that, I've got an a priori resilience because of my hermetic lifestyle and desire to watch horror films. But the paper, I sort of share everyone's sort of slight cynicism about telling 200,000 papers in the space of what will have been about 9-10 months is crazy talk. The thing that's really interesting about this paper is that they picked, like Derek was saying, a cohort of people who had robust diagnoses, followed them, reported the change. The only thing that I was slightly sad that they missed out on was the point that Sukhi was speaking to. If they'd only included a sort of self-report clinical global impression, something that says, what has changed for you on a scale of 1 to 10, scale of 1 to 7, what has changed for you? Have things changed substantially? Because I wouldn't mind betting, as Sukhi was pointing out, with people who are used to caring for people with long-term chronic conditions, they would say, well, not a great deal. Whereas if the control group in the Dutch study was people without a diagnosis, but who filled in the same validated questionnaires. So on the assumption those questionnaires are validated for people with diagnoses, I think that probably weakens it a little bit. Having a CGI, a clinical global impression, or some analog of that where people reported an impression of whether their life had changed substantially would actually answer the question that we've all been alluding to, which is this a group of people with disorders that would have been impaired in those things that lockdown has taken away from the rest of the population? I think that would have been a really nice touch just to add on to the end of it. But sorry, I did have a final point actually. The thing that Derek said was really interesting. The ONS released some statistics which got widespread media coverage. I heard it on the radio on the drive home one night, where basically it was one of these awful survey designs where they phoned people up and asked them a lot of vague questions about anxiety and depression. Now, the problem with that, I'm sure that the study was well designed if the ONS did it, but it got reported in the media as, 14% increase in depression, almost as if you can just equate asking someone about symptoms of having, lower than expected mood suddenly equates to a tsunami or a pandemic of clinical diagnoses. I think that's why this paper was refreshing, because it's actually solid clinically, I think, whereas a lot of the media headline attention grabbing stuff lacks that rigor. It's just, we asked about symptoms that if you were to do a giant factor analysis of our questionnaire against a whole bunch of clinically validated questionnaires applied to a clinical population, we'd find some overlap. Like my sleep's not great and I feel a little bit lower in mood. That's not good enough. Do you know what I mean? And I get really frustrated with reporting of that as new cases of depression or new cases of anxiety disorders. I think it does a disservice to people who actually have to struggle with these things year after year. On that slightly part, that was the only thing I had to contribute.
Two of the things struck me while you guys were talking. One about the methodology. I was the peer reviewer on a paper, I don't think it's been published yet, that was calling for standards in this type of work. But one of the challenges, of course, is for whenever the next pandemic might be, and will people abide by it? So it was all well and good. It was trying to anticipate it. And the other thing that struck me a while ago, I'm an external reviewer on a research trial. I'm not involved in it, but I'm involved in the ethical regulation of it. And other research is being hit. This research trial is looking at quality of life in a clinical cohort, and it's deteriorating for people, and it's deteriorating for reasons outside the control of the study. And the other thing that strikes me is other research. I don't know if you've comments on this, Sukhi, about other research trials are being impacted. How do you know if you're looking at intervention versus a non-intervention? How do you know what's impacting it now? So this other trial I'm thinking of, the quality of life and the social activity of participants has been really impacted by COVID. And I suspect COVID's going to draw a large streak through lots of research that spans it.
There were just a couple of things that occurred to me while you were talking. So the first one was Dawn's Contagion. And I think it was in the newspaper yesterday that our current kind of health secretary, Matt Hancock, is very keen and used a lot of analogies using around from Contagion when he was doing his health briefings to his colleagues. The second thing was around Dan's point about it's good to use these validated questionnaires, but actually one of the positive things that comes out of this paper is the fact that actually, although in the people who didn't have any illness at the beginning of the COVID, their symptoms increased, but actually in all of those people, nobody or very, very few people actually met threshold for developing a kind of clinical levels of symptoms. So actually there was an increase, a bit exactly like you were saying, in terms of sleep and kind of unhappiness, but it wasn't to a point where you developed a clinical disorder. And I guess the third thing is really around some of the patients that we're seeing who have a psychotic illness. And this paper doesn't really speak to their experience because the samples that they're following up are actually people with depression and anxiety. And it's quite possible that in people who need to go out to get context to their experiences, that actually not being able to go out and meet people may have a very different effect on their well-being than to people who want to synchronize, the outside world synchronizes to them. And actually that absence of ability to kind of contextualize and socialize may have a very different effect in different illnesses. So it may not be a one size fits all for an effect on mental well-being in people who already are ill.
Yeah. I work in a psychosis service, and the thing it's all very anecdotal, but it speaks to what Derek was saying earlier. But we didn't see a huge spike until the end of the first lockdown, and then we saw an enormous increase in referrals. And then what we've noticed is that the second lockdown has been really interesting because we have seen an increase in referrals, but we've actually seen a much higher rate of relapse in people that we've been working with for some time. So it's interesting how it's hard to disentangle, it's hard to unconfound whether or not these people have just been, because of the increased rate in referrals in August, these people have had less attention for their more chronic maintenance treatment, or whether, and that because we haven't attended to them, they've now relapsed, or whether or not it's a second lockdown, an additional non-specific psychosocial stressor around that's provoking relapse. It's really hard to tell. We also did some work on looking at our services use of, and contacts via sort of teleworking over that time. And really interesting, again, it's all very anecdotal and service evaluation, but we didn't see a massive drop in satisfaction with contact. I think the only part of our service that really noted the difference was a drop in contact for our clinical psychologists who were struggling to use, they weren't struggling to use in that they were incompetent. That's going to bite me. That's going to bite me really bad. It was more that there was a sort of lag between people being told that they would no longer be having face-to-face psychological interventions and deciding if they felt comfortable with the teleconferencing or televideo technique, you know what I'm saying, whether they would be comfortable continuing that treatment modality without the benefit of face-to-face. So they think there was a sort of dip and then a return of contact after that. But anyway, I'm sorry, that was just anecdotal, but I think it speaks to the kind of the power of this paper, which is actually talking about a clinical population and the impacts. Is there's more concrete there, there's more things to stand on, and more things that I think could sort of positively and usefully contribute to clinical practice and the design of services around this pandemic.
And it also lends itself to continued follow-up because it's a data set that continues to be collected. And of course, again, we think about post-infection, but the social outcomes of COVID are going to endure for some time. Okay, so our second paper is on a treatment, an intervention. So ketamine, which was an anesthetic, it's still used as an anesthetic, is also used as a drug of abuse. It's a dissociative, and now has been seen to have novel potential as a rapidly acting, pharmacologically unique antidepressant. So I think Dawn is going to talk to us about a paper from Nature.
Yes, please. So I'm actually really excited to talk to you guys in particular about ketamine, because if you come with me in the way back machine to when I was a wee undergrad, I was working in a psychopharmacology lab, and I was working specifically on projects with NMDA receptor antagonists. So at that period of time, we knew the history of ketamine, which is very similar to phencyclidine. Came about 1960. It was an anesthetic, right? Because it's got these sort of amnesic properties and these analgesic properties. Hits widespread abuse, handful, 5-ish years later. And ultimately, we find out it's got this incredibly interesting set of characteristics. So we call it staccato mimetic. So it effectively will mimic positive and negative psychosis type symptoms. And so you've got this really interesting drug, powerful, obviously, working on a beautifully complicated receptor, which is intimated in such sort of really important and central processes like synaptic plasticity, learning and memory, pain, right? All of this really big stuff. And cool, I'm interested, right? Let's dig in. And if you could have told that young woman that I would be talking to you about a paper where it is being used as an antidepressant, I mean, just mind blown. And so what I'm hoping before we start this paper is that you can fill me in on the last 20 years. How the heck has this happened? Tell me everything.
Thanks for doing that to us. This is your paper. You're the one meant to be lecturing us. I'll tell you my quick thoughts on ketamine. I mean, it's really interesting. So it's interesting in lots of ways. So one is it's doing something different. So our antidepressants today typically work on neurotransmitters in the brain, serotonin, noradrenaline, most of them. And this is definitely doing something else. So that's interesting of itself. And you're going to tell us later on exactly what it does. It seems to work really, really quickly. And that looks really interesting too. The thing that strikes me in terms of clinical practice is we've used the phrase in Kaleidoscope quite a bit, or at least I've put it in when Sukhi hasn't deleted it out, of the depressions. So depression maybe not being a single thing. And so the thing that interests me is the effectiveness data. And my take on that is that's still up for debate. So it looks really interesting. Some really positive stuff coming through. It's early days in terms of longer term outcomes. The question for me with any pharmacological agent, well, any treatment, psychological as well, is in whom does it work and when? So who might this be a really useful treatment? When might we use it? Ketamine, the licensing is varying. So at the UK, it's still being reviewed in the UK. It's just got European licensing. It will be expensive. But then as a clinician, the thing I think is the most expensive thing from a health economics point of view is someone who's not well. So if it works for someone, it's cost effective. Well, when might we use it? That's the thing that really interests me. So it's really, really interesting. I'd like more data on the effectiveness outcomes of it. And then the question for me is, when might I use this? Who might I use it in? And that part I still feel unsure about.
I think for me, it's this idea that we've got this drug that is, as you mentioned, sort of radically different in terms of how it works, which is a benefit and also a great mystery. So we've got a receptor system that is just largely completely outside of what we would consider to be a good target for mental health in general. And we know that it can have really sort of detrimental effects as well. But it seems that in cases of treatment refractory depression, this provides a really rapid and long lasting, in comparison to the sort of serotonergic mechanism stuff that we have right now. So it's a really interesting thing. But the thing is, nobody was quite sure how it worked. And you know, this is very much a lab bench paper, right? And so that's why I want to bring it to you guys, because I think oftentimes it's really hard to see the kind of direct translation from a proper bench paper up to your daily gig. And I want to talk about that space, because we knew from human postmortem studies that there was a decrease in activation in this major signaling pathway called mTORC1, which is neither here nor there. It does a ton of stuff, so you kind of go, oh, okay, and then you move on. But then they were able to take a look using some sort of brain slice stuff, and they were able to say, oh, well, actually, we see these impacts in the areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, that we know are associated with this. And so it's definitely part of this antidepressant picture for ketamine. And what this paper did was really, I thought it was a great triangulation of techniques. They really kind of covered all their bases. So they said, right, okay, what are the possible downstream impacts of this mTORC1? And there's these eukaryotic initiating binding proteins. And 1 and 2 is what we'll call them. It's not even directly relevant. You can read the paper. But the point is that these guys are actually this sort of key. So when you impact them, you change translation. mRNA translation, which ultimately builds proteins, does work, and is how we make things happen. And so what they did was they used mice, so fair enough, mice, but they first just did some basic immunohistochemistry. So do these things that we suspect are part of this process, do they exist in the right cells in the right places? And they did. They were able to isolate them to excitatory and inhibitory neurons, and they looked PFC and hippocampus. After that, they did some really great stuff with some just knockouts. So they only knocked out 1, only knocked out 2, had some wild type, and they ran them through a whole series of behavioral tests, which are known to show sort of depression analogs. And they were able to show that you couldn't get the effects, right? It was necessary. The presence of 1 and 2 were necessary for the antidepressant effects of ketamine. And when you had that, you got quick, like within 1 hour response, and it was sustained. They only tested up to 7 days, but far beyond what you saw with basic serotonergic SSRI. So they did that. They did some electrophys to double check that, in fact, this was completely connected to ketamine's ability to induce synaptic plasticity, which we think is really where that long-term change comes from and sticks with. So they piece these things together really beautifully, and they deliver what I think is a very clear declaration that, in fact, BP1, BP2 are absolutely necessary and likely the key action point for the antidepressant effects of ketamine. And again, protein synthesis, not normally what we would talk about here. However, you've got a lot of baggage with ketamine. You've got cost, which is sort of something that could probably go away in a while, but you've got the really unpleasant side effects. You've got the abuse liability, and you've got all the nasty bits, right, that make everybody go, ketamine. And in fact, if you can find out where is this leverage point, where is this sort of ratchet, you can design. And so I like to look for papers with hope. And for me, this is about hope. It's about a purposeful creation of a really unique category of drug that could possess the antidepressant properties for treatment-resistant folks that ketamine does, but can wholly go around the problematic aspects. I'm sure someone's working on it now.
Derek, this is a question directed at you, following on from what Dawn was saying. When it's used as a substance of abuse, is there a habituation or a tolerance?
Yeah, so this is the concern with it. Of course, it's used. The dosing is very, very different. But this is a concern with this as a medication. Is there a dependency problem for people?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder also not just in terms of tolerance habituation for dependence, but also tolerance, which means that
loss of effect.
it becomes it loses its effectiveness after repeat administrations.
And the treatment protocols, as I'll have to double check what they are again. They're over a shorter period of time, but of course, that's not how we typically pharmacologically manage depression. And so, what we don't have at the moment is we don't have data over people on medication for 2-3 years. But many people on antidepressants will be on them 2-3 years, and that's the other thing for me that's interesting in terms of thinking. So, if we take that this has therapeutic value. Again, it goes back to the question of when and in whom. So there's another argument that maybe it's a medication that might be used for some people at an early stage of depression, whilst then instigating other interventions. So let's go with a model that, say, it only works in the shorter term, but it's very rapidly acting. Well, that would be a very, very useful intervention to have. And that is potentially life-saving for many people. And in fact, that's something we really don't have now. We have the opposite in a sense. We're often faced with a situation talking to people about medication where we have to caution that its effect might take some time. So that's the parts, to go back to your point, is, so one, I don't think we have the data on what's going to happen longer term. So is it going to be in the future that it's going to, where will its niche lie if it has value? Is it shorter term for people? Is it, because the other thing too is when they take on treatment refractory individuals, that's really helpful and useful to look at. But one of the things, unfortunately, we know pharmacologically that the biggest predictor of failure is past failure in other interventions. And maybe there should be more research looking at people who it's first episode. But that's kind of contrary to the current model of how we do research and investigation on pharmacological agents. It's often on treatment, people have been resistant to other interventions. So I'm still not sure where it's going to lie as part of a tool that we use.
I think another group I thought would be interesting to try. I mean, given the paradoxical use of benzodiazepines for stuporous catatonic patients, I just wondered whether or not ketamine might have a role in that as well. I mean, it's a bit of Gladwellian thinking, i.e., if it's counterintuitive, it must be right. But it would be interesting to see whether it had a role in that, particularly if the underlying driving affective process was a severe depression.
There's also earlier data which has looked at it. So a reduce in suicidal thinking in some people that seems to be outside its antidepressant effect. And again, that would be an incredibly useful and life-saving thing potentially for some people. So we could see another intervention stream where it's not just for depression per se, but people who are feeling suicidal.
I guess one of the things that you both kind of discussed is that even in the paper they actually, it's robust enough that they try and test whether fluoxetine has some of the effects that you see with the ketamine, and they demonstrate that it doesn't. So in a way, it's really interesting that it is a completely it's offering a new mechanism. So in itself, I think that's interesting because that then supports Dawn's idea that by understanding the mechanistic pathway, you can start developing other interventions which may be useful. And if they'd found that actually you could replicate the effects with fluoxetine, it would have been slightly less interesting. And the other thing from the kind of psychosis end is that for a long time, we've been using ketamine as a kind of experimental probe to try and understand the mechanism underlying psychosis. And the story has been that if you give ketamine, you simulate psychotic symptoms, and some of the things that they describe are actually increased cognitive impairment and kind of negative symptoms, which can often overlap to some degree with kind of depressive elements. So giving ketamine in that environment seemed to be almost simulating depression. So I guess there's a few other questions which are worth thinking about, because that doesn't seem to come out in the trials of ketamine, that it doesn't seem to be pro-psychotic in the folk. Otherwise, it would have had a few more regulatory issues. But when I read the paper and it talks about the impact of ketamine and its disinhibition effect on pyramidal cells, working through these fast-firing parvalbumin positive GABAergic interneurons, that's the same pathway that's supposed to be the underlying kind of underlying process for developing psychotic symptoms. So why it doesn't have that is also an interesting question for me, because it's not quite clear. But I really share Dawn's kind of enthusiasm for the fact that using these multiple techniques to try and answer a question is such a superior way of trying to address something, being able to look at the mechanism of it and using genes, electrochemistry, electrophysiology, plus a kind of pharmacological probe, plus the understanding the actual kind of sequencing that's going on in terms of developing these proteins or building the proteins, that it seems to be, if we can link that kind of a bit more upstream to the people to answer your question about who responds and who doesn't respond, I think that will almost kind of complete the cycle. And it really encourages this way of thinking about how these different systems impact on each other. So we're interested in behavior, which is the kind of depression phenotype, that you feel sad and it affects your sleep and appetite and you feel hopeless, which is quite a kind of high order end result of something that Dawn's describing as happening practically at an intracellular level and building changes within cellular synaptic plasticity. So tying these levels together, you need one or two additional steps to kind of understand how these are going to fit together.
Sukhi, what you're saying is that you've got multiple levels, but you've got an explanatory gap between the cell physiology and the behavioural phenotype, if you like. And then, of course, you've also got multiple levels of explanation across species, right?
In mice, always in mice.
Well, things are looking good for mice. Okay, fantastic. So there are two papers there. So COVID and ketamine, the links will be on the website. So thank you for joining us. Hope to see you soon.